Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Words of Life podcast with Kevin Bruni and myself, Adam Kitt. This week, we're going to be diving into chapter 9 of the book of Hebrews again, and we're really excited to do that with you. Let's dive right in.
Sing them over again to me, wonderful words of art. Let me more of their beauty see, wonderful words of art.
All right, well, welcome back, Kevin. I'm hoping you're having an amazing week, as am I. I'm batching it again as your lovely sister, and my bride is off to work. And it's a different schedule this year, so there's a few of her trips that are 2 weeks in
Yeah.
a row, which are a lot less fun than just 1 week,
Sure.
compared to last year. So we're it's a little bit of a growing pain, but fewer trips, fewer
Saves on the
flights
travel,
to
right?
pay
Yeah, for
for.
sure. Mhm.
I mean, there's some goods and bads, but that just leaves leaves Noah without a mom for 2 weeks, and leaves me handling a lot more uh longer periods of time, longer stretches. But
Yeah.
we're blessed to have her be able to continue to work, and as I grow my business, so it is overall much more of a blessing than it is a curse. But we miss her dearly when she's gone. So
For sure, for sure.
yep. You guys missing your kids? You're officially like basically empty nesting now, right? So,
Yeah, I
well,
mean, it's true,
except for
especially with
the
babies, right? Yeah, infants
yeah,
around all the time. So other than that,
except for yeah, you just couldn't handle the idea of empty nesting, so you just surrounded
that
your house with newborns, which
that's
is
right. That's the case. So there are two of them here living here now,
yeah,
ours, and then our sister-in-law moved in with her infant. So yeah, we now have two of them. So we pick them up together sometimes and from daycare for her before she gets back from work and all that good jazz. But yeah. Two babies under 4 months in our house, and two kids in college. So
that's wild. That's
yeah,
wild. What a crazy time. What a crazy time. All right. So last week we actually were able to cover the entire chapter 8, which was really cool. And in that chapter, the author of Hebrews, who we don't know who exactly it is, we just call him the anonymous author of Hebrews, um, covered the fact that God always intended to bring about a new covenant, that the first
yeah,
covenant would be made obsolete. The second covenant would be fulfilled through all of the things that Christ did in becoming our high priest and establishing the new covenant that was then available for all of humanity rather than just being isolated to the Jews, and all of the blessings that go in with that. And I think that that's a basic, pretty good summary. I think. Can you think of add anything for recap?
no, I think that's right. I mean, he does that long passage from Jeremiah that he uses to
Yeah,
demonstrate that there was a new covenant coming, and he ties that to the fact that because Jesus was a priest, he couldn't be a priest after the law because that was not how it was. So it
right.
necessitated a change of the covenant. But that was always the plan, and that he uses that passage from Jeremiah to sort of cite that the day is coming when I'll make a new covenant, he says, and he
Yeah,
describes what that's going to be. So, yeah, and that's sort of his point because remember, he's trying to convince his readers not to go back or go into for the first time into Judaism, right, as
right.
something to add to your Christianity or just to replace it altogether.
Yep.
It's not really clear, but yeah. So he's always citing from the old law, saying even the old law itself says, right, there's something new that
Right.
was
You
coming.
should have been prepared for this,
That's
but
right.
and now it's time. So here we
Yep.
are. All right. Well, let's go ahead and dive into chapter 9 today. Add to stage. There we go. Chapter 9 of the book of Hebrews starts off with this. The editors have added the title, "The Earthly Holy Place." Says there in verse 1 of chapter 9, now even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness. For a tent was prepared, the first section, in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of the presence. It is called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a second section called the most holy place, having the golden altar of incense and the ark of the covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden urn holding the manna and Aaron's staff that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail, which means there's a lot of detail that he could be adding and including and explaining here. But because his readers are of the Hebrew culture and heritage, they hopefully understand all of the things that go into why all of those details were important.
Yeah, and his readers could certainly go back and just look up if you want to know more about those, right? You can go look all those
Yeah.
up in the law. I mean, those are described in detail, right? About
Yep.
down to dimensions and everything about how big the ark was and how big the lampstand was and what it was going to look like and what
Yep.
the bowls of the things for the burning the oil looked like.
Yeah.
I mean, every detail, right, is there. And so he said, we can't speak about these now in detail because why? It would take way too much print, right?
Yeah.
And if you want to know, just go look it up in the law.
It's
right?
already recorded.
Yeah.
It's already there. Just go back and
Go
look
check
at
it out. Yep.
Yeah, and you can find references to that in Exodus.
Yeah. And kind of all
Leviticus.
over the place. Yeah.
Yeah.
When you're looking, right. If you want to know about what those things looked
Yeah.
like, you can look in the law, which that's described.
Yeah.
And then some of these other things he talks about, right? About we were talking beforehand. These things in the ark, right? I mean, we know they're there from Hebrews, but if you want to go find that in the Old Testament, it's not like just one place, right? You go and you look and it says, here, make this Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of the Testimony. Here's what it's going to look like. But then it doesn't say, and inside it, you're going to put X, Y, and Z, right? Those things happen at different points. So when the manna first comes down, right, then Moses tells Aaron, hey, go collect a pot of it, put it in a pot. We're going to keep it throughout the generations as a testimony. And then it says, and so they put it before the testimony, which we believe means inside the Ark of the Covenant, especially because Hebrews says that's what that meant.
Yeah.
And same thing with the staff, right? It's later when Aaron's rod or staff buds, is there's some contention about, which tribe and why are the Levites, more holy or why are they picked, kind of a thing. And they take all the staffs of the different people and they put them out, Aaron's rod buds, and then they say, hey, take that, and it's going to be a perpetual thing throughout your generation. So put it in the Ark of the Testimony, right?
Yep.
So you got to kind of read through some of the early history of the Exodus and the wanderings there to find that. But he says, yeah, you can go read about all those things. If you want to go read about them, they're somewhere else. That's not really important to us, right?
Correct.
What's going to happen there.
So what's interesting, though, is you talk about the Ark of the Covenant.
Yeah.
Okay. So what did that mean? We've already discussed what the covenant was. It was an agreement, a contract made with God and his people to bring about Jesus. But in that covenant was, I will be your God and you will be my people if you keep these commands.
Yeah.
The Ark of the Covenant was a symbolic representation of that agreement. And it was the focal point of the redemption of the people for the sacrifice of their sins that the high priest would do every year. What's interesting is that we talked last week about the eternal nature of the new covenant, the eternal and spiritual nature of the new covenant, compared to the one that was not perfect and was never intended to be eternal. The Ark of the Covenant has had a rich history, the physical ark itself.
Yeah.
I mean, we've even made movies about it.
That's right.
Indiana Jones, right? And a lot of it is absolute hogwash and fiction, but it's captured the imagination of generations, thousands of generations of people, because it was the representation of where God himself would be present for the people on this planet.
Yep.
And the cherubim and their wings overshadowing the mercy seat, and the mercy seat being the representation of where the blood would flow and cleanse the sins of the people. And Jesus, that was a shadow of the real mercy seat that Jesus now occupies.
Yeah, and that whole setup there, right? I mean, you'll sometimes even see in the Old Testament, God is talked about as the one who dwells between the cherubim, right? And being a direct reference to this, when the people would travel around, the cloud of the presence, the Shekinah cloud would rise up, and that would tell them it's time to move, and they followed the cloud around. And then when it would stop, they would set up, and then when it set up, the cloud would literally descend upon the tabernacle, right? And what he was signifying, and that the place where that was happening was inside the Holy of Holies, right? Like this is the place where God dwells. representationally, and that was happening through that cloud, right?
Right.
But representationally, that's how that was taking place. And the way he's describing it here is setting it up that there was the tabernacle, but even inside the tabernacle, there was the Holy of Holies, right? That was the
Right.
place where God lived, right? If you asked sort of
Yeah.
the Jew, and it's not they really believe he lived there, but that was where God dwelt, was in that place.
Mhm.
That's how he was representing to them, I will be in
Correct.
your midst, right? I will
Yep.
be with you, as he would dwell. That was his house, effectively. And and later when they turn that into the temple, right? We even see David saying, it's not right that I would live in a house. There's this beautiful house of paneled cedar, and the God of Israel lives in a tent, right? So even still, they're having that mindset of this is the place where God resides,
Mhm.
in a representational sort of way. And so he's just reminding us that first covenant, right? Even the first, that as he's talking about from chapter 8, there was the first and the new. The first one had its regulations for worship and an earthly place where that happened, an earthly place of holiness.
Mhm.
He's reminding you what that was, because he's going to, in the next section, talk about how that was a picture of
Yeah.
what that looks like in the new covenant. Because this idea of now even the first, it already sort of suggests that then the second also will have regulations for worship and a place of holiness, right?
Yeah.
That just the structure of the sentence suggests he's going to do that. And if you
Mhm.
kind of read forward, we'll see that's exactly what he does.
Yeah. I do kind of want to unpack the idea of the I don't know, personification perhaps of the Ark of the Covenant itself. If you read through the history of Israel and everywhere the Ark of the Covenant was involved,
Yeah.
sometimes the people felt like they had God's blessing because they were in possession of the Ark of the Covenant.
Yep.
And that was false. God said, if you keep my commandments, I will be with you. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean if you keep the Ark of the Covenant safe, then you'll have my blessing. It wasn't such a sacred artifact that it just the possession of it equaled salvation, right? That wasn't the
Yeah.
covenant. It was merely an object of representation. Now, God had told them, "You shall make no idols." It wasn't a thing
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
be worshipped. It wasn't a thing to be. It also wasn't a thing to be taken lightly. God,
Yeah, and
God
you can
gave
see
there.
sort of why they would like have that mindset, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you see stories in the Old Testament, right,
Hmm.
where things will happen. Like they decide, hey, we're losing, so we're going to take the ark out, and that will then give us victory. And they lose, right? And so
Yeah.
that would suggest, oh, it's just a box. But then that
Hmm.
the Philistines take it and they put it in a temple, and weird stuff
And
happens there, right? The
Dagon
idols
falls
fall
over,
over.
right? The next
They're
day, his
all sort
arms
of
fall off.
cursed. Yeah, the people of that town are cursed, so they go, we got to get rid of this box, and then everywhere it
Yeah.
goes, they're cursed. They send it back, and where they end
Yep.
up storing it, right, just ends up
That
at some
guy's
guy's.
house gets blessed.
It's blessed for years and
Yeah.
years and years, right? So you can see why they would have this idea that, oh, the box itself has this really
Right.
great like power, right? And that's sort of the Indiana Jones idea or story. The box
Yeah.
itself has this power, and it says whoever has it or controls it, right,
Right.
will be unstoppable as an army. Like that's sort of the premise, and you can
Yep.
see where that idea comes from. But right, that idea was
Mhm.
already wrong when they took it out to the battle and lost it.
Right.
And later they will think, about Jerusalem. God's never going to punish Jerusalem. He's never going to
Yep.
bring his wrath against us in before the exile, right? Because
Yeah.
this is his place. This is where his temple is. This is
Yep.
where his box is. This right, like this is the place where God dwells. Surely he will protect Jerusalem because it's his house, right? And he specifically calls it out in the prophets, saying, "You've got the wrong idea. Don't think that I'm not going to destroy the place just because my temple is there. I'll wipe it off the
Right.
map," right? And he
Yeah.
does,
Yeah.
and carries them off into exile. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, they have this interesting relationship with the ark throughout their history for sure.
Right. Well, I guess in reference to is there ask tongue tied.
Meh.
I oftentimes ask myself, okay, what type of an application can I pull out of this
Sure.
idea of the Ark of the Covenant being a representation of God's blessing upon me? We know that there's no physical temple anymore. There's no physical Ark of the Covenant to look to as God's dwelling place here on this planet. God's supposed to be dwelling in me. You know,
Right.
we've already studied through multiple books that have talked about the fact that we're supposed to be living with Jesus in us
Yeah.
and having the light in us. So how can I embody the Ark of the Covenant, right? In a practical way today? Is there something I can learn about that? It's just a question to ask, and I think I would ask that just of you guys. Just if you have any ideas how we can live with that idea in our minds, and is that something that can help us to live better, more God centered lives, having that idea of the covenant of God being present daily in my life.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
think that's a good mention there because of the three things he says. One of them is the tables of the covenant, the tables of the testimony were in the
Yeah.
ark, right?
Yeah.
And so the corresponding sort of idea would be like what we saw in chapter 8, right?
Mhm.
That it will write my law on their hearts. It's not going to be
Yeah.
in a box; it's going to be in their
Right.
hearts, right?
Yeah.
Is sort of the connection there that he makes. So what does that mean for us practically? Is a good thing for us to think about there.
Absolutely.
As we dig into the next section, right? His key point as we kind of get there, though, of all those things he wants to talk about, this idea of the mercy seat and the cherubim of glory overshadowing it, that's his kind of key piece of what he's going to take forward, because he's going to talk about something that happened with the ark, sort of on this yearly basis, and the other things as well. But really, he's gonna dig into that idea of that mercy seat as being the important thing, not the manna, not the golden rod, not the table of showbread, right? This thing is going to be important as he moves forward.
So go ahead and take it at verse 6 then.
Yeah, so verse 6 says, "These preparations having thus been made, the priests go regularly into the first section, performing their ritual duties, but into the second, only the high priest goes, and he but once a year, and not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the unintentional sins of the people. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy places is not yet opened as long as the first section is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation." And so we see there, right, this idea that he wants to talk about is here's what that was like. And we've mentioned this in previous episodes that, on the outside, the priests went daily. They had lots of things they had to do. In fact, even some of those ideas, it's not just the outer courtyard, but even into the tabernacle itself, they went into the first part every day to replace the showbread that he talked about, right? You take away this sort of,
and to keep the incense burning and the
add
candles
the
lit
incense,
and
do these things, that kind of stuff
changing out
happened
the oil and all
Yep.
those things.
But then he talks about the second piece, right? And this section here, 6 through 10, is sort of what he's talking about in verse 1, right? The first covenant had regulations for worship in an earthly place of holiness. Here's what it was like, and here's what some of those regulations were. And his thing he wants to talk about there is this idea of that into the second place, into the most holy, only the priest went, and only once a year. And he did that to offer atonement for the sins that were committed by himself and the people, right? And there's a lot there to unpack. But in verse 8, his point is the Holy Spirit in that whole picture, in that whole setup, was indicating that the Holy of Holies was not for you. Right. That's what he's trying to show the people. No one goes there. You can't go there. You're separated from God. That's where God is, and you can't go in there. And so he's saying that the old covenant, right, the old law with all of its regulations, was supposed to be telling people a picture saying that the way to God is blocked. You can't get in that kind of presence because of the sin that's in the way, because of the only time you go in is to do this, and only the high priest does it. It was a symbol to showing that the holy place was not yet open under the old law, which suggests he's hinting at, well, what does that mean? That it is under the new, right? That's his hint that he's making at there.
Right.
And so he's setting up that idea. The old law, God was closed off, which is another way he should have been suggesting that there's a new covenant coming, right? That it was not always going to be this way. And so that's kind of his main point there in that chunk of verses there.
Right. One of the things that really jumps out to me is in verse 9. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper.
Yeah.
So the idea that you would always have a guilty conscience because that arrangement couldn't perfect your conscience. You were constantly reminded, actually, of your downfalls and your sins and how imperfect you were, and had to continually offer sacrifices, food and drink and washings and regulations for the body imposed until the time of Reformation, which is the time we're in now. The old covenant has been reformed into the new one. It's not talking about some future extra reformation or some
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
the reformations that are referred to in church history, for instance,
Right.
post AD. But I know personally, uh, dealing with guilt is something that's a struggle for a lot of people. I've met a lot of people who continue to suffer with guilt, and a lot of it is self-imposed. And I do believe that it comes from a good place, and yet it's an unhealthy thing for us to carry guilt for things that we've done. However, you see examples like the Apostle Paul, who used his previous life in a way that didn't weigh him down to inaction like it does with so many people, but he utilized it and was so appreciative of the fact that he was able to obtain forgiveness, and yet he always kept it top of mind that he has a lot to be thankful for because of how much forgiveness he's received, how much grace he's received. But I think that's something that we need to think of, that our conscience can be perfected under the new covenant, and we can have no guilt. We should have guilt for when we do wrong, but if we repent and we turn from those things, we should be able to be free, those strings cut and left in the past. Which is a struggle. It's hard. It's a hard thing to do.
Yeah, and that idea is right. You should feel guilty if you're guilty, but we shouldn't continue to feel guilty after we've been cleansed or purified.
Right.
And that's going to be his important point that he's going to make here in a minute, because he's saying again that they couldn't perfect the conscience of the worshiper, which means, at least it suggests, that at least the people in the old law knew, like, all this stuff I'm doing really doesn't like. How does my sin or my uncleanness get atoned for by this or that or the other, right? It doesn't. And in fact, I'm reminded of that because every time I have to come here and do it again, it reminds me how sinful I am, right? Like
Right.
every year when you brought the sacrifice, or anytime you had to come to make some rectification for ceremonial uncleanness, even, right? Not even sin, but
Right.
it just reminded you all the time. You were constantly in remembrance of the things that you
Yeah.
had
I mean,
done
a
wrong
a
according to the law.
family member dies and
Yeah,
you
right.
have to move their body,
Yeah.
right? If you touched a dead body, you were unclean,
Yep.
Women once a month were unclean
Yeah.
for a period of time, right? So there was this constant, just, I got into the wrong part of town, and
Yeah.
I crossed through where the lepers were, and I need
Yeah.
to be, whatever, right?
Continually reminded of it.
Um,
Yep.
yeah. So constant reminders of that.
Yeah.
Our constant reminder, our Ark of the Covenant, should be the fact that Jesus is now sitting on the mercy seat for us, and we have him to thank, and we can always look to him and always be perfected through Jesus and have our consciences clean. So
Yeah. And so digging into that conscience idea, I think if we jump into the next couple of verses here, 11 through 14, it's going to talk
yep,
about that perfecting of our consciences through this other sacrifice, right?
right.
Starting there in verse 11.
Yeah, it says, but when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? So there's a whole bunch. It's kind of a sidebar explanation in there. So for if the blood of bulls and goats were able to sanctify us, we wouldn't need Christ, right?
Yeah.
But it's a really long run-on sentence, basically.
Yeah, and he does say that there's something in there, right? Like,
Yeah.
so in 13, the blood of, if that's true, the blood of bulls and goats and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer, they sanctified for the purification of the flesh. And so what he's talking about there is, under the old law, there were ways which you could become unclean, but there's ways then you could become clean again, right? But again, that was only about this sort of physical uncleanness that happened, and it wasn't really about sin, but it was about this physical uncleanness. And so his point is, under the old law, you could become clean, you could be purified in your flesh by these different things, right? And if that's true, if that is true, then how much better then would the blood of Christ himself be, right? That's sort of his argument he's making.
Right.
And so, if you want to read about those, you can read about all these different things. Numbers 19 will talk about that whole like cow bit, right? The ashes of a heifer. There's a whole detailed explanation of how they made this purifying ash water mixture, basically. Right? They'd go out and they'd kill the priest would do all these things to become clean, and he'd watch while they burned this cow, right, that was totally never been used for anything, and then someone else who was clean would go out and clean up the ashes. They would gather all of them and they'd keep them in this place, and then they would use those ashes when these different things happened. They'd mix them with water to do these different things, right? To wash and purify themselves. And the comment there in the old law and here in Hebrews is, and that really worked, right? Just, it worked because that's what the law said to do, to become clean from your physical impurities, right? Touching a dead body, whatever else, right? And so he says, if that's true, then the blood of Christ should be worth more than that. And so there's two things going on, right? One is, there was the type of sacrifices that were made for goats and calves and these things that the priest offered to cleanse himself. And then he'd go in to the Holy of Holies and he'd sprinkle the blood as well on the mercy seat. And he said that happened. That was that once a year thing, right? One time he'd go into that place. And now what he's saying here is, Christ, he went into the greater tent, the more perfect tent, the real tent, which is not a tent at all, because it's made without hands. It's not of this creation. It's in heaven somewhere, right? And he entered in once, not once a year, right? But once, and he didn't go in because he'd cleansed himself with bulls and goats. He went in and brought his own blood to buy eternal redemption. And so if he did that, right? So that's what he did. His blood was used for that. It was used to buy you back from your sins. It got you eternal redemption. But then he makes this side comparison. And we know that all these other things, like the ashes of a cow and the blood and bulls of goats, could cleanse you from physical impurities, physical uncleanness. And he says, well, if Christ offered his blood, then it can actually remove and purify your conscience, right? So we talked about that guilt before, where all those things before just reminded you of your guiltiness. But he says this sacrifice, which he made for your eternal redemption, as a bonus, it also purifies your conscience. And because your conscience is purified, you can now serve the living God. And that thing it's purified from, I like this. It's purified our conscience from dead works.
Right.
And those dead works, what are the dead works, right? Well, the dead works are those works of the law, right? Those things they did all the time that didn't really give them any sort of cleansing of their conscience, right? They were just, and why were they dead works? Well, they didn't do anything, for one, but for two, they were all about killing things most of the time, right?
a lot of death, a lot of blood.
lot of killing things, a lot of
Yeah.
blood of bulls and goats and pigeons and whatever else, right? And so he says, you've now been cleansed from that. And so
Right.
because you're free from that, you can now serve the living God. And so that's an idea that we see in scripture a lot that we want to ignore or miss out on, right? And that is, we are free to serve, right? We've been freed from our sins, and that now gives us all this great time to serve God, right? It's not we're free so we can go serve ourselves. It's not that we're free so we can go serve our own lusts. We're free from sin, so now we can serve God, right? Which is it rubs us the wrong way sometimes as freedom loving people, right? We think we're free means I can do whatever I want, but that's not biblical freedom, right? Biblical freedom is you're free from this master, so you can choose another one, right? So you can be the slave of another. Effectively, you can now serve God because you're free from sin. You're free from that, so you can now serve him and have a clear conscience while doing it, because you know you're not still tied to this other master of death and these dead, fruitless works there.
Yeah. So one of the things that it's easy to gloss over, and especially because it's English. But in verse 12, it says that he, Christ, entered once for all into the holy places. Well, that phrase "once for all" it has a multitude of meanings. Once for all time, and once for all people.
Yeah.
So the "all" there is a really big word, even though it's 3 letters. He did it one time for all time, meaning it'll never have to be done again. In comparison to the high priest offering blood every year for themselves
Yeah.
and then for the people. Jesus got rid of that by doing it one time for all time. And then he did it one time for all of mankind, both historically, present, and future. All time, all people. So that this idea of the old covenant and the sacrifices that were required, it's a dead work. It'll never have to be repeated, never have to be done again, because Christ's sacrifice was perfect, and it was so much higher and holier than mundane bulls, goats, pigeons could ever be.
Yeah. And so that's going to push you to 15 there, right?
What's that?
That'll then push you into 15, right?
Well, yeah, but while you were talking, I was actually thinking about I was trying to find it in Romans. He talks a lot about Paul talks a lot about slavery in Romans. And there are multiple passages that talk about the fact that we will be a slave of something. We're either going to be a slave to sin,
right,
or a slave to righteousness. We just have to choose who's going to be our master.
Yeah.
And so because Christ has offered us this eternal redemption and a purified conscience, we need to choose him. But it comes with serving. We are free to serve. That's what you were talking about. And so we're going to serve somebody. You just need to choose the one that's going to last for eternity, which does come with some sacrifices. It comes with sacrificing all the here and now pleasures and the sins and all the things. Listen, sin wouldn't be so popular if it wasn't fun.
Right.
But yeah, anyways, I was trying to find the verses, but it's all through Romans in 6, 7, 8. He talks a lot about that concept of slavery. So why don't you go ahead and read 15 and stop somewhere in there?
Yeah, sure. So starting in 15, therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since the death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. For where a will is involved, the death of the one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God has commanded you." And in the same way, he sprinkled with the blood both the tent and all the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. And so he has a lot to say there about this new covenant, but really just how it got started or what was required to institute it, right?
Yep.
And so Jesus, is the mediator of a new covenant, and he's going to have something to say about, so that all who called may receive the promised eternal inheritance. Like, that's what the covenant is about. But the whole section there is about, since a death has occurred that redeems them from transgressions committed under the first. So his point is, if you have a covenant, there has to be death to institute it. And we will sometimes call our sections of the Bible, and not sometimes, almost all the time, the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? And the only other time we ever use the word testament is we talk about someone's last will and testament, right? And that's the idea he's hinging on here. And that's not to say that the covenants of old required death and blood as well. Go and look at the things with Moses, right? Or with Abraham, and how he said, take these animals and cut them in half, right? Death was involved in establishing covenants. But the way we can think about it is someone's last will and testament. When does it become effective? When does it go into effect? It only goes into effect when that person dies, right? That's how it works. If I have things in my will that says all of my children get all of my earthly possessions, right? They can't come now and say, well, all of this is mine, right? It says so right here in this legal document. And the court would say, yeah, that document doesn't take effect till he's dead, right? That has no force while he lives.
Yep.
And so he says, since Christ died up above, he offered his own blood, verse 12, right? Then the new covenant is in effect. And he then says, and that's just like the old covenant, right? Because you might say as a reader, well, who died to make the first covenant go into effect, right? And his answer is, lots of animals died for that, right?
Yeah.
Everything they did, right? And
Yeah.
so when you go and you look, they're like, okay, here's the law of the covenant. And he said, sprinkle it with blood, right? And here is the tent of meeting. How are we going to inaugurate? Sprinkle it with blood, right? And here is sprinkle it with blood. And here's the people, sprinkle them with blood, right? Everything you sprinkle with the blood of some animal. And that's how those things were consecrated for worship, right? And so he says the blood of the covenant was all over everything, right? It was all over the tent and the vessels, and everything was sanctified through sacrifices, blood sacrifices, right? And so he says in 22, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood. And you could say, without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sin, right? Because even under the old law, how did that happen? You had to go and kill these animals, and shed their blood, and use the blood to purify things. That's how it happened. And
well,
so
it goes all the way back to the very, very beginning.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Adam and Eve were told, if you do this, you will die.
Yeah.
Well, Satan comes along and says, you're not going to die. But they were going to die, just not in the way that Satan inferred.
Yeah.
It wasn't going to be an immediate punishment by death. You will then stop, your heart will stop beating, and you'll stop breathing, and you'll pass away from this planet. No, you will die spiritually. From that day, the death of our soul has always needed redemption. And the blood is the life of a thing.
Yeah.
And that's why blood was chosen as the redemptive substance.
Yeah.
Because it represented life for a life, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and the idea of the scapegoat, for instance, right? All of our sins would be, represented in this goat, and that life would be, those sins would be gone away.
Yeah.
And all of those, as a kid growing up, I always thought it was, the priests always they were like the best butchers in Israel, because they were killing all the animals all the time. But when you read carefully through the instructions that were given, the man in behalf of his family, he would bring the bull, and
Yeah.
he would take out his hand. He would take the bull by the head, and he would slit the throat of that bull to kill it as a sacrifice. The people were very intimately involved in the shedding of the blood because of their sin.
Yeah. And you could say, even going back to the beginning there, you talked about, right, that there wasn't an immediate physical death, but it's clear as well. It says we got to send them out of the garden, right?
Yeah,
So they can't
there
take
was
hold of the tree of life and live
Yeah.
forever. There is one of the first things that happens after this is all revealed, is it says, so God made animal garments for them to cover their nakedness, because what they had sewn together was not sufficient. Well, where'd those animal garments come from? Right? They killed something, right? Immediately, it's an immediate consequence of sin was this death that happened.
Yeah.
You talk about how, the life and the blood being connected, and that's throughout the old covenant as well, with the laws of even the things they ate, right? This is how you're going to do it. This way you'll spill the blood out on the ground when you kill this thing. You're not going to eat the blood with, you're going to drain the blood from the animals before you eat them. Because why? Because the life is in the blood. The life is in the blood, right? Over and over again, we see that idea. And so death was happening all the time throughout the old law. It was how the law was consecrated in the first place. And so in a similar way, right, the new covenant was also going to be done with blood as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if you want to try and push through there. We're getting long on time, but
I think it's okay. I guess we can recap. Let's just go ahead and read through it at least, and then we can start here next week.
Yep.
So, so just to finish up at 22. Indeed, under the law, almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. Thus, it was necessary for the copies of the heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own, for then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. So it really kind of wraps it up nicely here, bringing it full circle about what we've been just discussing today, is that Christ himself entered into the holy places like no high priest had ever been able to do. And it wasn't the one made with hands. It was into heaven itself to appear on our behalf in the presence of God as our mediator, as our high priest, as our ultimate sacrifice, cleansing our sin with his own blood, which is crazy to think about.
Yeah, and so I don't want to gloss over this too much, so we will pick this up next time there as well.
Yep.
But yeah, it's good to connect that, right? That in the previous one, that things were done with these animal sacrifices that purified them, and so it was necessary. If the copies, right, were going to be purified with these animal sacrifices, then the real had to be purified with something better, and that something better then was the blood of Christ himself, right? That's what then sanctified the new covenant and sanctified those true things, as opposed to the mere earthly copies of them. Yep.
Right. So this idea that Christ will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. That's a really big concept. And there's a lot of false doctrine out there these days that are altering that message,
sure,
unfortunately, that we have to be aware of and have to combat with the truth given to us clearly in the scriptures. So with that, we'll wrap it up here this week, everybody. We really want to thank you so much for tuning in and being with us through this study of Hebrews. It's certainly a great study for me. I'm learning a lot, even though I've read the book a bunch, and it's one of my favorites to study. It's always good to dive deep and to just recall the amazing story of the Bible, as displayed through this book. How God always had a plan to bring the salvation of mankind to full fruition through His Son Jesus, through the sacrifice that He made for us. And we have so much to be thankful for in Jesus, and the fact that He's our high priest. He's sitting on the mercy seat on our behalf, that we can have clear, guilt-free consciences through Him and through His blood, and to receive salvation for all time, and then to, of course, look forward to His returning to redeem all of mankind, those who are eagerly waiting for Him, like I said there at the end. So we need to be eagerly waiting for Jesus. That's really the message, I think, for this week. We need to keep His presence with us, just like they had the Ark of the Covenant. We need to get into the Word, pray, and give ourselves up to Him. Let our light shine and get out there in all of the areas in our lives where we are around people. Do something nice for somebody this week, and go out of your way to do it. So, any last words, Kev?
No, I think that about covers it.
All right, everybody. God bless. If you have anything that you need from us, don't forget to leave those in the comments. Drop us an email anytime you'd like, and we will see you next week. God bless.